Members, James Quintero, Texas Public Policy Foundation, here to articulate a few high-level thoughts on the state of play with respect to today's property tax system. I actually want to begin by praising the efforts of the legislature and its persistent attempt to lower taxes. And in fact, as everyone here knows, last session, state lawmakers passed a historic $18 billion tax relief package that employed an all-of-the-above approach to return ample surplus back to taxpayers. And as a result of the legislature's leadership, it was anticipated that the average homeowner would experience a reduction in their tax bill of $1,266 in year one and $1,312 in year two. And of course, thanks to the leadership here, we also added a bit of a sweetener for the elderly and disabled. Their projected tax savings was estimated to be a slight bit higher at $1,436 in year one and $1,482 in year two. Now that's a historic measure of tax relief, but it is not some one-off event either, and rather it's the latest in a series of attempts to meaningfully reduce the tax burden in Texas. Other recent attempts to lower taxes include 2019's $5 billion tax rate compression, 2021's $800 million homestead exemption increase, and of course, this legislative session's $6 billion proposal. Thus, in three of the three last legislative sessions, policymakers have taken concrete steps to lower taxes and appear poised to do so again. Now, here's the bad news. In spite of all of this very good work, many Texans feel overwhelmed by the current property tax environment. And as evidence, what I'd like to point you to is some latest polling data from WPA. This is one sheet in your handouts. This is a new February 2025 poll of nearly 1,000 registered voters. And what it shows is that 83% of survey respondents strongly or somewhat agree that property taxes represent a major burden for them and their family. 18% of respondents strongly or somewhat disagreed with that sentiment, and 4% did not respond. So we have almost more than 8 in 10 Texans agree that taxes today are a major problem in spite of the legislature's efforts. And as you'll see on your sheet, what that figure has done over the last several years is increased noticeably. In fact, since April 2022, the number of people expressing alarm with the state of play has risen by 12 percentage points. So what does all of this information tell you? Well, to me, it suggests two things. One, the legislature is doing its part on tax relief, and two, most people aren't feeling it. So what's the problem? Well, I believe it comes down to one factor, and that's local government excess. Here's what I mean. There seems to be a tendency among cities, counties, and school districts to erode state-directed tax relief through aggressive rate hikes, large bond elections, and an overutilization of non-voter approved debt instruments like certificates of obligation. These are intentional policy choices that have the effect of frustrating the legislature's intent and keeping the cost of government high. And I'd like to punctuate that thought with a little bit of local data. So to their credit, Travis County actually does a fine job of estimating and relaying what the average homeowner's total tax burden is. And here's what they show over the last couple of years. In 2023, the average Travis County resident shouldered a total tax bill of $9,219. This is prior to the legislature's major tax relief initiative in 2023. In 2024, that tax bill, that same property owner's tax bill, was actually reduced to $8,873 as a result of compression and homestead exemption increase. In 2025, which would be year two of the tax relief package's effect, the same individual's tax bill rose to $10,356, which is about $1,100 more than that initial 2023 amount. What this shows is that the legislature, despite having appropriated enough for that person to hypothetically enjoy $1,300 of tax relief in year two, saw their tax bill radically increase. And so this raises the question, what are the factors that prompt such a dramatic increase in this community's tax bill? Well, again, I go back to the terrible trio of rate hikes, bond elections, and COs, and I want to punctuate that point with a little bit of data and evidence as well. So staying here in Travis County, consider some of the things that happened over the last few years since the implementation of that 2023 tax relief measure. In June of 2024, Austin ISD adopted a tax rate that increased the average taxpayer's bill by $290. And as was pointed out by Representative Troxclair, shortly thereafter, the district held a voter approval tax rate election that added another $494 to that person's tax bill. The sum total of those two actions, those two rate hikes, was to add almost $800 to the average taxpayer's bill. That is an astounding amount that erodes more than half of what was intended by the legislature. Now let's move on to bonds here quickly. In November 2022, Austin ISD proposed a $2.4 billion bond package, knowing that tax relief was likely on the way. That package was the largest in the district's history. In November 2023, Travis County pitched and passed its own largest bond package in the county's history, and possibly next year, Austin City Council may approach voters with a $1 to $2 billion climate bond to fund a range of environmental projects. I'm not sure if that's the largest bond in the city's history, but it's large by my measure. Now, of course, the net effect of taking on all of this new debt here in Travis County is that their tax bills are increasing radically. And of course, there's also the matter of COs. It's worth noting that in December 2022, again, shortly before the start of the last legislative session, Travis County opened its new civil and family courts facility. This facility was constructed through the issuance of $333 million of COs. What's really frustrating about that particular instance is the fact that voters had actually turned down that same project several years prior at a normal general obligation bond election, and yet county officials utilized COs to go around that decision and do it anyway. Now, these are, of course, I understand that a majority of this body does not represent Travis County, but I dare say that some version of these happenings are occurring throughout the state, right? I think in many communities, we see aggressive rate hikes, large bond elections, and the issuance of COs to a degree that is concerning. And it is taking away from what the legislature has done both in 2023 and prior. And so in light of previous experience and our current predicament, my plea to the legislature today is twofold. One, go big, and two, guard the gains. And here's what I mean by both. When I talk about going big, I hope the legislature will seek a higher measure of tax relief. In fact, the foundation is in lockstep with the governor's office. I believe that $10 billion or more is the right figure when it comes to tax relief. So I want to encourage the body to consider that. This would represent a substantial investment in taxpayer well-being and a responsible use of surplus monies. And of course, as we all know, the state is well positioned to deliver such relief. We have not only a large general revenue related surplus of $24 billion this biennium, but also $27 billion in ESF balance expected by FY 2027. So I hope, again, that the body considers going bigger. Now, when it comes to guarding the gains, I'm talking about tax reform. I believe we need to institute strong new taxpayer protections that ensure whatever relief is provided by the legislature lasts. And so to help the body consider a few ideas, what I've done is I provided a list of 35 different recommendations in this handout. I've even tried to color code them by type, articulate what the problem is, and provide a solution. The proposals are broken down by M&O, INS, and other reforms. I, of course, don't have time to go through all 35, but what I'd like to do is just touch on one in each category and then hopefully answer any questions that you might have. So to the M&O reforms, one thing that I think the legislature ought to consider is bringing uniformity to the voter approval tax rate system. What I mean is when the legislature first adopted that 2019 reform, there were several carve-outs included in the law that allowed cities under 30,000 population to still observe that old system that allowed for an 8% revenue increase and still has a petition process. A similar dynamic is in play for community colleges and hospital districts. I think all taxing units ought to be subject to one easy to understand revenue limitation, whether it's 2.5%, 3.5%, that's your decision, but there ought to be one simple measure applicable to all taxing units across the state. Secondarily, one thing that I've noticed here recently is that local governments don't like being told no. And what I mean specifically is in the INS, when it comes to bonds and INS reforms, one thing I hope the body will consider is instituting a cooling off period after failed elections. We had an incident last year with Willis ISD. It approached voters for the third time in 2 years with the same or substantially similar proposition, and voters again said no. But there's no reason that voters should be put in that position where after they said no once or even twice, that a governmental entity comes back with the same question. I think that's egregious. I think it's akin to a child pestering a parent for a piece of candy. And the legislature ought to take steps to make sure that the voters' decision is respected by that taxing unit. And then the last item that I'll touch on is the most important in my mind. I think a lot of the things that we consider here are very important with respect to controlling the property tax, but the most important thing that we can do to control the burden of government is to institute a local government spending limit. What I mean is we need to apply the same standards that the state observes down to the local level. And right now, for those of you who may not know, the state is subject to 5 different statutory and constitutional spending restrictions. We ought to take 1, 2, or all of those restrictions and apply it down to the local level, because until we get a handle on local government spending, we're never truly going to do right by taxpayers, because governments will find a way to squeeze taxpayers for whatever money they need. With that, I thank you for your time, and I look forward to